Jeffrey Dahmer, an American serial offender, committed gruesome murders between 1978 and 1991. His crimes included luring young men to his home, drugging them, and engaging in horrific acts. Despite evading capture, he was arrested in 1991 after a victim escaped and alerted authorities. Dahmer confessed, receiving a life sentence. His case captivated public attention and inspired media depictions. Ted Bundy, an American serial killer, murdered numerous young women in the 1970s. Born in Vermont in 1946, he had a troubled childhood. Bundy's crimes involved luring victims, often college students, to secluded areas before assaulting and killing them. Despite multiple arrests, he escaped custody twice before his final capture in 1978. Bundy was convicted of multiple murders and executed in Florida in 1989. His case is one of America's most notorious. Nielsen is England's most notorious serial killer. He preyed on young men of unconventional orientation, brought them to his house, tortured and dismembered them. The remains were dumped in the sewers, which is what allowed him to be caught. He acquired his skills as a butcher while serving in the army as a cook. The investigation assumed that the account of the serial killer more than 20 victims, but proved 6. Nielsen himself credited himself with 15. Anton Charles "Tony" Costa was an American serial killer who was active in and around the town of Truro, Massachusetts, during 1968-1969. The dismembered remains of 4 women were found in or near a forest clearing where Costa grew marijuana. His crimes gained international media attention when the district attorney falsely alluded to cannibalism. Richard Ramirez was an American serial killer and rapist. In the mid-1980s, Ramirez committed a series of brutal crimes in California. His methods included housebreaking, rape, murder, and torture. Ramirez was caught in 1985 thanks to tips from the public and was convicted of the murders and other crimes. He was sentenced to death in 1989. Richard Ramirez died in prison from complications in 2013 while awaiting execution. Joseph Paul Franklin was an American serial killer. Between 1977 and 1980, he committed a series of racially and politically motivated murders. Franklin was also known as a sniper shooter for his ability to commit murders at a distance. He was arrested in 1980 and sentenced to death for killing one of his victims. Franklin was also convicted of other crimes. His death penalty was carried out on November 20, 2013, in the state of Missouri. Larry Gene Bell was an American criminal known for his crimes in the late 1980s. He became best known for the kidnapping and murder of 2 girls, Shari Fales and Deborah Mayo, in South Carolina. In 1985, Bell kidnapped Shari Fales and buried her body on his farm. He later kidnapped Deborah Mayo and did the same thing again. His crimes attracted public and media attention. In 1996, Larry Gene Bell was sentenced to the death penalty. John George Hay, commonly known as the acid bath murderer, was an English serial killer convicted for the murder of 6 people, although he claimed to have killed 9. Hay battered to death or shot his victims and disposed of their bodies using sulfuric acid before forging their signatures so he could sell their possessions and collect large sums of money. His actions were the subject of the television film A is for Acid. Arthur Shawcross, American serial killer. In 1972, he was convicted of murdering 2 children and served time in prison. In 1987, after being released on parole, he began a series of murders in New York State. Shawcross chose his victims from among women. He committed a series of brutal murders and rapes. He was arrested in 1990 and was sentenced to 250 years in prison for 11 murders. John Martin Scripps was a British serial killer. In 1995, he became known for his crimes in Southeast Asia. Scripps often targeted his tourist victims, offering them cheap tours and then killing them to rob them. Scripps was arrested in Singapore in 1995 after his last victim disappeared. He later confessed to the murders of several people. In 1996, John Martin Scripps was executed by hanging in prison. Michael Bruce Ross was an American serial killer. He committed a series of murders in Connecticut between 1981 and 1984. Ross targeted young women and girls as victims. He was arrested in 1984 and confessed to the murders of 14 women. Ross was sentenced to death and spent many years on death row. He was executed by lethal injection in the state of Connecticut. Ronald DeFeo Jr. became known for his involvement in the tragic events that occurred on the night of November 12, 1974, in Amityville, New York. On that night, Ronald murdered his parents and 4 younger siblings in the family home. DeFeo was arrested and convicted of the murders in 1975. He claimed that his constant family conflicts and voices compelled him to commit the crime. Aileen Wuornos was an American serial killer. She committed a series of murders of men in the state of Florida between 1989 and 1990. Wuornos claimed that her crimes were acts of self-defense in response to sexual assaults. She was arrested in 1991, convicted of the murders, and sentenced to death. Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Andrei Chikatilo was a notorious Soviet serial killer known as the Butcher of Rostov, or the Rostov Ripper. He murdered over 50 people, mainly young women and children, between 1978 and 1990. Chikatilo was arrested in 1990, sentenced to death in 1992, and executed. His case remains a subject of study in understanding serial killers' psychology. Henry Lucas was an American criminal. In 1983, Lucas was sentenced to death for a murder in Texas. He confessed to a huge number of murders, but many of his confessions were later found to be false. Studies did not corroborate many of his claims. In 1998, his death sentence was changed to life in prison, and Lucas died in prison on March 12, 2001, of a heart attack. Charles Manson was an American criminal and cult leader. In the 1960s, he formed the Manson family, a cult group that became notorious for its gruesome murders in 1969. Manson and members of his family were arrested in 1971. He was sentenced to death in 1971, but after California abolished the death penalty in 1972, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Charles Manson died in prison on November 19, 2017.